Stuff stays outside.
Securing the hatch to an only closed position, your HEPA filters.
In a chemical or germ attack, this million-dollar filter room would remove contaminants before they could reach the crew inside. Meanwhile, a ship-wide sprinkler system would be washing the residue from a chemical or germ attack into the sea.
The USS Ross has to be capable of dealing with the threat in 2030 and beyond, as well as it is here in the last year of the 20th century.
At just 505 feet long, you could place two of these ships end-to-end on an aircraft carrier and still have room left over. But when it comes to eyes, ears, speed, and power, the Aegis destroyer starts to look like a pretty formidable bodyguard after all.
Coxswain!
I've got a short statement to make, after which there will be no questions. And I apologize that you have been here for a very long day without anything coming from me. I have the following remarks to make. I want to give you an assessment of where we've got to. Our job here at these military-to-military talks has been to translate the political agreement into a workable military reality on the ground. The Yugoslav delegation presented a proposal that would not guarantee the safe return of all the refugees or the full withdrawal of Yugoslav forces, and indeed was inconsistent with the text produced by the President of Finland, Ahtisaari, and Mr. Chairman Erdin as the Russian Balkan Special Delegate. NATO, therefore, has no alternative but to continue and indeed intensify the air campaign until such time as the Yugoslav side are prepared to agree to implement the agreement fully and without ambiguity. We are prepared to meet with the Yugoslav delegation as necessary to achieve it. Thank you very much indeed.
NATO Sunday unleashed one of its most formidable weapons on the embattled area of the northern Albanian border crossing of Marini. B-52 bombers from miles overhead sent a devastating rain of bombs falling on the area of Gorashov, just inside the Yugoslav province of Kosovo. The thunderous explosions pounded the air throughout the mountain valley. The force of the blast could be felt kilometers away. The mountain plateau had been the scene of a day-long artillery and mortar duel between Serb forces and members of the Kosovo Liberation Army. If NATO's show of force was meant to silence the two warring sides, it failed. Minutes later, the same hills were echoing with fierce exchanges of guns.
Here, those troops were sent into Kosovo to launch a brutal offensive against the ethnic Albanian population. The expulsions began, and people were forced to flee to refugee camps in neighboring Albania and Macedonia. The Serbian military, as opposed to the Yugoslav, is estimated to be 110,000 strong. Some 40,000 are deployed in Kosovo, and Milosevic knows he can count on their loyalty. Their pay is higher, and their privileges are more generous than those of their counterparts in the Federal Army. The motivation of these units is also higher. It's largely fueled by the myths surrounding a greater Serbia that the soldiers themselves propagate. They believe that, just as the Serbs fought the invading Turks 600 years ago, they are battling an aggressor today. Western military experts warn against underestimating these forces. They say the troops are organized in decentralized units with numerous supply depots at their disposal. That structure is based on that used during Tito's partisan campaign in World War II. It enables them to react swiftly and flexibly. The Serbian military hoped this strategy would serve them well in a war of attrition. Technologically speaking, analysts say the Yugoslav army is where NATO was in the 70s. But still, what it has got is robust and reliable. And it's the fear of a tough and efficient air defense system that many observers say is behind NATO's hesitation in using Apache helicopters in combat. Even though the Serbs may appear to be close to capitulating, underestimating the morale of their forces could be a costly mistake.
Well, but short and to the point.
To continue and indeed intensify the air campaign until such time as the Yugoslav side are prepared to agree to implement the agreement fully and without ambiguity.
The British-led build-up of the Peace Implementation Force in Macedonia continues apace, but Belgrade's tactics are clear. Move negotiations to the United Nations and delay. Every day's delay is to the advantage of Belgrade and...
The awesome power of the B-52 bombers blasted Serb positions on the border with Albania again today. NATO is giving Slobodan Milosevic the clearest signal that his forces will continue to be attacked inside Kosovo until a withdrawal is underway. The day began with fast jets circling Serb positions to tempt them into opening fire. The screech of the ground-to-air missiles could clearly be heard as the planes dropped flares to divert them. Once NATO had pinpointed the anti-aircraft positions, the heavyweight bombers were called in.
The logistical problems of withdrawing 40,000 troops through a shattered province in just 7 days. With bridges destroyed and the infrastructure damaged, they could be demanding more time. Another theory being floated is that Serb troops are hiding their atrocities. It could be they're playing for time while key bits of evidence like mass graves are tampered with, obscuring any link between Belgrade and war crimes. Tonight, the air war continues and the strike missions go on. But more hopefully, there are reports this evening that the military talks between NATO and the Serbs are poised to resume. So despite the crisis, it is also apparent the negotiating process is still alive. Robert Moore, ITN.
ITN's...
No peace over Kosovo today, as first one bomber, then another, then waves of them searched for targets and struck. American B-52 bombers pounded Mount Pastrick, one of the key battlegrounds of the war. Day 75, and the war goes on. The target of this attack isn't obvious, but these bombs have landed high enough for thousands of Serbian troops to see them. The message is clear. The war goes on. Sign up to the peace deal, or it will intensify. NATO dropped bombs for hours, then leaflets for the Serbs. While you are fighting for Milosevic, it says, his riot police are fighting your families who want you out of Kosovo. Serbia's troops show no sign of pulling out. Shelling Kosovo's rebels today, raining mortar fire on a string of villages.
The campaign of airstrikes against Yugoslavia has been focused in recent days on Serb forces on the ground in Kosovo. In the latest...
Elite Russian paratroopers from Razan, the first to go, should Russia take part in a peacekeeping force in Kosovo. 10,000 Russian soldiers would take part, Russia's special envoy to the Balkans says. But defense analysts say the price tag for such a force is way beyond Moscow's means.
Kosovo, where the infrastructure has been totally destroyed and everything you need to bring everything for the troops in, almost including water. We're talking about hundreds of millions, maybe to the tune of $1 billion.
Could widen when it comes time to fix Russia's role in a peacekeeping force, with a likely debate over who will give the orders and who will foot the bill. Steve Harrigan, CNN, Moscow.
Disappointed because many of them had thought NATO was close to leading them back into Kosovo, the main sticking point in the collapse of the talks.
The Yugoslav delegation presented a proposal that would not guarantee the safe return of all the refugees.
General Jackson reportedly was furious at the Serbs stalling, but left open the possibility that talks could resume. A Western diplomat told us he was not surprised by the breakdown in the talks, that Washington was correct in exercising caution about them. The diplomat said he was, quote, not optimistic.
NATO tells us they will maintain lower-level contacts to work out the minutiae of the technical agreement. How many troops? How many tanks? Where will they go? Over what bridges and roads? Then when and if the time comes to sign the big issues, NATO can move in swiftly to keep the peace. Lou Waters.
Peace. These soldiers, Maroon Berets, are heading for Macedonia. 300 of them from 5 Airborne Brigade are to join their colleagues already in Skopje.
The soldiers are looking forward to going out there. It's why they join the army, it's what they're trained for, and they're determined to do an excellent job.
It's the second flight from RAF Bryce Norton in as many days. Several others are expected later in the week. Most of these soldiers are used to danger. Some have spent time in Northern Ireland, so they're well prepared, both mentally and physically, for the task ahead.
I'm very happy because I have never been in a situation like this before, and it's a gold-plated opportunity, for all of us to go there and do the job, as best as we can.
We've been trained very hard all over the world for this type of scenario, so yeah, it's just putting everything we know, all our experience into practice now.
The troops boarded the 747 ready for their 3-hour flight. They're not sure what to expect and have no idea when they'll return. After a 2-hour delay, the 747 was finally in the air, heading for Macedonia. The troops will be in their positions later tonight. Di Harper, Sky News, RAF Bryce Norton.
NATO tanks and troops in Macedonia are still moving into position to move into Kosovo, despite the overnight unraveling of marathon talks between Allied and Yugoslav generals. NATO said its terms for Serb withdrawal from Kosovo were non-negotiable. The men from Belgrade challenged that and wouldn't budge.
NATO, therefore, has no alternative but to continue and indeed intensify the air campaign.
The Yugoslav generals argue that a 7-day timetable for pulling their troops out of Kosovo is too quick. It can't be done. And they challenge NATO's demand for a buffer zone inside Serbia to protect Allied peacekeepers. But NATO sources say the root of the disagreement's not military, it's political. They blame Slobodan Milosevic for stalling. In fact, the military men haven't stopped meeting. No generals and no fanfare, but the lines of communication are still open because NATO's convinced the deal's not dead.
I get the feeling that we're going to go into Kosovo as NATO, we're going to accomplish the mission, and we're going to get the refugees home.
When it will happen.
This is Serb TV's version of why there are problems agreeing on the peace plan. It doesn't do enough to ensure the Kosovo Liberation Army is controlled. The report alleges NATO launched airstrikes to back the KLA in its operation codenamed Arrow. NATO bombed us heavily, the sergeant says, but no one broke through.
Security correspondent David Martin has the facts and the story behind the story from the Pentagon.
Despite NATO's vows to intensify the air campaign following the collapse of the withdrawal talks, commanders were told to use caution in striking Belgrade in an effort not to antagonize Russia, which has opposed the bombing from the start. The Serbs are using the respite to repair their electrical power grid. But right now, U.S. officials say getting the Russians on board is more important than keeping the lights out in Belgrade. But that did not stop B-52s from striking Serb forces in Kosovo over the weekend. Pentagon officials say the carpet bombing caught several hundred troops in the open. Today, the bombing is supposed to be heavier.
The number of sorties is expected to be 2 to 3 times higher today, strike sorties, than it was yesterday.
2,000 U.S. Marines, who would be the first American troops to go into Kosovo, were to have come ashore in Greece this morning. But with the Serb pullout on hold, the Greek government has not yet granted permission.
Kosovo. The strikes are the first around the Yugoslav capital since President Slobodan Milosevic accepted a peace plan for Kosovo last week. NATO intensified its bombing campaign after talks between the alliance and Yugoslav military planners were suspended Monday. NATO spokesman Jamie Shea says it's part of a strategy to get Belgrade to come back to the table and sign a deal.
For the second straight day, NATO B-52 bombers pounded Serb positions on a mountainside straddling the border of northern Albania and Kosovo. More NATO jets followed, adding to the powerful display. In addition to dropping bombs, NATO warplanes are also dropping leaflets like these. Messages littered all across the countryside to Serb soldiers. a form of psychological warfare. The leaflets show a photo of what appears to be Serb police breaking up anti-war demonstrations. The message reads, "While you are fighting in Kosovo, your families are protesting for peace back home." There is anything but peace on the Albanian border. These images are of KLA soldiers, reportedly in Kashari, a few kilometers inside of Kosovo, and the recent scene of heavy fighting. Both the Serbs and KLA reportedly use international volunteers to bolster their numbers. The Kosovo Liberation Army accuses the Serbs of enlisting Russian troops, while this Dutch KLA soldier is said to be part of an international brigade, known only as Marco. He says he's motivated to fight because of what happened to his family over 6 years ago.
I was in Croatia from 1991 to 1993. And my wife and kid get killed in Croatia, in Karlovac. So that's why I won't say I hate the Serbs, but, you know, this war has to be ended, be stopped.
But the fighting shows no signs of stopping, and both sides count and mourn their dead.
Test of nerve for NATO, and they've held it. US Marines exercising aboard a carrier task force in the Adriatic underlined the message that the diplomacy was backed by force. President Clinton spoke to Tony Blair and agreed that all options remained on the table. The aim was to warn Belgrade that if there was no progress towards peace, then NATO would go back on a war footing.
Two officials today on their way at high speed to a rendezvous with the Serbs. The press were not invited, but we managed to film the meeting at a secluded spot on the Macedonian border. NATO are anxious to keep open their lines of communication with the Yugoslav authorities. They're still hoping Mr. Milosevic will sign up soon to the withdrawal of all his forces from Kosovo. But for NATO liaison officers, it's been exasperating and frustrating.
Maneuvers in Macedonia are being overtaken tonight as diplomats mount their own offensive aimed at retrieving the peace plan. But there's little camouflaging NATO's opinion. Belgrade is trying to block the peace implementation force. General Jackson left the door open for more talks today. Contact was resumed but lowered down the chain of command. The senior Serbian generals still reject his roadmap of retreat. The first sticking point, the timetable for that retreat. NATO's demand all Serbian forces and weapons out of Kosovo in 7 days. Belgrade insisted 10 days to 2 weeks was needed. The second problem, NATO's call for a 25-kilometer deep demilitarized buffer zone inside Serbian territory on the border with Kosovo. That was a retreat too far for Belgrade. Last but not least, the Serbians wanted concrete guarantees their troops locked in frontline battles with the KLA near the border with Albania would get safe passage when the withdrawal began. The British-led build-up of the peace implementation force in Macedonia continues apace, but Belgrade's tactics are clear: move negotiations to United Nations and delay. David Cheta, Sky News, Macedonia.
Artillery tanks, multiple launcher rocket systems, armored personnel carriers, and mortars in large numbers. As I can say with confidence, we destroyed, not just struck. Last 24 hours, many of the targets, because air crews observed numerous secondary explosions. And as you know, secondary explosions occur when fuel or ammunition ignites, and thereby increasing the lethality of weapons used. NATO's air forces will continue to hit military targets until appropriate agreements have been reached, and we are pretty close to it.
Despite the diplomatic hiccups, this looked remarkably like an eve of battle pep talk to the assembled troops by Defence Secretary George Robertson. Not quite in the Montgomery mould, perhaps, on the eve of D-Day, but definitely a rallying call, despite the fact that some of these troops have been here for 3 months and have heard it all before.
I made a number of statements there that I've been reminded of as we've gone on. I said I didn't know what we were going to have to ask you to do. I didn't know what the mission was going to be. I didn't know what the time length was going to be, but we had to be there. But that I wouldn't be asking you to fight your way into Kosovo. Now, these last words have come to haunt me a little bit in recent days, because, as the military know, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Just who the enemy is, apart from Mr. Milosevic, Mr. Robertson did not say. He may well have been thinking about Russia or China or the United Nations, all of whom seem determined, having let NATO do the dirty work so far, to steal some of its thunder with the end in sight.
It may be called a peace force, but it's increasingly preparing for war. And these men will be in the vanguard of the force that first goes into Kosovo.
The job of 5 Airborne Brigade, British and Gurkha paratroopers now moving into position a few miles from the Kosovo border, will be to chopper in at low level and secure the hilltops overlooking the first few miles of the road into Kosovo and its bridges and tunnels, all known to have been mined. Speed, they say, will be absolutely crucial to enable the armoured battle group to move up the road. Unless that 8-mile-long defile can be secured, it will be impossible for the NATO forces to move into the vacuum that will be left by the retreating Yugoslav army. The first 6 hours, say the military planners, will be vital. All of this, of course, assumes that the men who've planned it all will still be in command. If this becomes a UN rather than a NATO force, all bets are off, if only because UN forces invariably turn out to be at best ineffective and at worst a shambles. Keith Graves, Sky News, Macedonia.
The NATO air campaign goes on. A Yugoslav oil refinery has been hit, the fire raging out of control. The Prime Minister
was flying high over the border during the last 2 days. Between 400 and 800 Serb soldiers are thought to have been in the area when the aircraft attacked.
Kosovo waiting for the order to go in. They include 1,000 men from the parachute regiment, and with them more than 600 Gurkhas. Soldiers with a mystique all of their own. Men famed for their curved knives, the weapons they use when the ammunition runs out. It's this airborne brigade that will secure the route for Britain's tanks and infantry. And today's senior officers were planning how to protect NATO's forces on the road to retreat.
So these are dangers that you are going to face, and clearly I wish you well with the mission that is ahead of you. I wish you courage and I wish you luck.
The hope, of course, is for a peace agreement that sticks. But for Western leaders, crunch time on a decision about whether to prepare for a ground war is fast approaching. The troops we've spoken to here today say it is a war they are more than willing to fight, but one the politicians remain reluctant to commit to.
The heat, the dust and the hidden horrors of Kosovo await these troops, and tonight it's likely they will be entering in peace rather than in war. Mark Austin, ITN, with British forces in Macedonia.
To be a thriving small town in Kosovo. Now it looks more like a ghost settlement. The buildings are deserted or destroyed. The people have been driven from their homes. Livestock wander untended in the streets. This, the German Defense Ministry says, is where the German contingent of KFOR, the International Peacekeeping Force for Kosovo, will probably see service. Most of the 4,300 Bundeswehr soldiers who are likely to be sent into Kosovo are already stationed in neighboring Macedonia. The 600 A4 troops responsible for logistics and humanitarian work will stay where they are in Albania. A large proportion of the German A4 contingent is made up of this Signals Corps from Dillingen in southern Germany. They're now stationed just outside the Albanian capital, Tirana. This relay station, manned by 10 Bundeswehr soldiers, handles all communication between Albania's only international airport and NATO's headquarters in the country.
My company will continue working to ensure there's a line of communication for the A4 headquarters here. The refugees are going to stay in Albania for a while, and we will have to continue making sure communication channels are kept open.
It's a different story up the Cegrane refugee camp in Macedonia. Many German soldiers assigned to this camp as humanitarian workers have already been posted elsewhere. As the chances for peace in Kosovo grow, preparations are moving ahead to send in international troops. The German mission is likely to be similar to S4 operations in Bosnia. Engineer units will undertake reconstruction work, setting up drinking water facilities and clearing landmines. Bundeswehr doctors will help run field hospitals to look after the health of the military and the returning refugees. In short, the Bundeswehr will help to make sure the terms of the peace agreement are kept, and that includes registering evidence of war crimes. This battalion, stationed in Tetovo, could soon find itself in Kosovo.